All right, I am Santiago Molina, Professor of Anatomy and Physiology here at Tallahassee Community College. And I am going to try to present to you the pectoral girdle. So the pectoral girdle is the bones that connect the upper limb to the axial skeleton. And so it's made up of two bones, the scapula and the clavicle. Now be careful that you don't fall into the trap of calling them by their regular names. So that's not the shoulder blade and the collarbone. It's the scapula and the clavicle. Okay, so the scapula is going to have several features that you want to make sure you know. So if you place the scapula in a way that this kind of handle is facing up, you can almost grab it with your hand like a handle, right? That is always going to be posterior, and then this surface is going to be anterior. So posterior, anterior. And then if you follow the direction of that handle and find it as you go and trace it to one side or the other, you will know that if it points to the left, it is the left scapula. So as you find this handle and find the edge of it, the big blunt edge here, that is known as the acromion. So this area right here is the acromion of the scapula. Follow that ridge that comes through, and right in the middle here is where we find the spine of the scapula. Acromion and spine. As I rotate it towards you, and you can see this flat but slightly indented area, this is called the glenoid fossa or cavity. And this is the place where the head of the humerus articulates. So glenoid cavity or fossa. And then just anterior then to that, like a mini acromion, this one is called the coracoid process. So there is then the acromion, the spine, the glenoid fossa or cavity, and the coracoid process. So this is the scapula and the features that you need to remember about the scapula. The second bone that connects the upper limb to the axial skeleton is the clavicle. The clavicle has two ends. As you can see, it's a S-shaped bone with a relatively blunt end and a flat end. The blunt end is the portion that connects to the sternum, and thus it's known as the sternal process or sternal end. Whereas the flat one is the one that connects to the acromion of the scapula. And so that one is known as the acromial end. Okay? You can tell whether this is right or left by placing it in front of you. The sternal end is going to be on one end, and outwardly you have the acromial end. And the curvature in front is always anterior. So this is going to be the right clavicle. There are clues that you can find and ask your professor to also help you to figure out which one's right or left a little bit more accurately. But this is then the pectoral girdle. Okay, so we move to the bones of the upper limb, and the bones are the humerus, and you can see here where it actually articulates with the glenoid fossa of the scapula. The humerus articulates with the two bones of the forearm, radius and ulna, which obviously articulate with the carpals of the hand, that's the wrist bones, the metacarpals, and the phalanges, which are the fingers. So we're going to focus on each bone at a time. The humerus is going to have a head, a round ball, that connects to that glenoid cavity of the scapula to form that shoulder articulation, which is known as a ball and socket joint. The humerus has also many features on its distal end, the distal epiphysis, which is where the elbow connects to the humerus. And so in that area, you would have features that you can recognize. This kind of rounder portion towards the lateral side is known as the capitulum. Okay? The capitulum is going to also be flanked on the opposite end with the trochlea, which is a little sharper in looking. It's not as round, so you can notice that there's like a little sharper edge to it compared to the capitulum. The coronoid fossa is this little indentation here that you will see later on as the ulna has a little process that articulates into that fossa, rotates into it. So that's the coronoid fossa. In between here, this little groove is what we call the trochlear notch. And then you would have the medial epicondyle, famously known as the funny bone, the medial epicondyle, and you would have a lateral epicondyle. So this is the anterior portion of the distal end of the humerus. But the posterior portion shows you a larger fossa that is known as the olecranal fossa. So this is recognizable because it's much larger than the coronoid fossa, which is on the front. But this would be the humerus. Now, as we move towards the forearm, you will see that the ulna actually fits right into that. And so notice that there is a little process and portion of the ulna that rotates into that coronoid process. So that's the coronoid process of the ulna. On the back side, you will see how the olecranon articulates and rotates into the olecranon fossa right there. One of the ways to recognize the ulna, as I remove the humerus out of the way, is that the ulna kind of looks like a wrench. Okay? And so that's recognizable because it has this indentation there. So now we can recognize in the ulna the proximal end by the elbow, the olecranon. Okay? We also have the coronoid process. And then as you look carefully, you will notice that right there, there's like a little smooth notch that's known as the radial notch, and it is the place where the radius rotates and articulates with the ulna. So it's called radial notch because it is where the radius connects. Okay? On the distal end here, we have also a kind of like a roundish wheel-like structure. Unfortunately, on this model, we don't see the styloid process, but it would be the pointed end that usually forms on the wrist, that little bump on the outer portion. One of the tricks to understand the ulna is that the ulna is the bone that is the elbow proper. So when you lean your hand or your arm and you lean your elbows, you are literally putting your weight on the olecranon. And it is always the bone that is on the side that goes towards the pinky. So the ulna is always on the side that goes towards the pinky. On the radius side, it's the one that goes to the thumb. So it's always going to be on the outside as your palm of your hands are facing in the anatomical position. The radius has the characteristic of this round wheel-like end that is always at the elbow joint. And it is the portion that connects to the radial notch of the ulna. There is a radial tuberosity, this little bump here. It's a rough looking bump on the also proximal end. And on the far end, you will see a also similar notch to what you saw in the ulna, but now on the radius. And it has the opposite name, the ulnar notch. And that is the place where the ulna connects and articulates with the radius on the distal end. And then you'll see also a very clear pointed end called the styloid process of the radius. So the styloid process of the radius is always at the distal end, and it's always lateral. It's always lateral. So this would be the radius. And so all of these are the bones of the arm. So we move on to the bones of the wrist and hand. So the first thing you want to locate on the overall hand is the thumb, and you can see that the thumb is going to have a thicker bone compared to the other four, and shorter. It's later on we'll see these are the metacarpals. So the carpals are the wrist bones, and they're tricky. So if you find the thumb, and you will notice that there is a bone in between the thumb proper and this kind of like long bone on the bottom. That is the first one I'd like for you to know, and it's called the scaphoid. The scaphoid is followed as you move laterally by the lunate. Scaphoid, lunate, which if you move the bone a little bit, it has a little lunar shape. That's why it's called the lunate. And then the triquetrum, and the little small bones called the pisiform. Okay? Then as you come back, above the scaphoid is the trapezium, which is followed by the trapezoid, followed by the capitate, and then the hamate. And notice the hamate has this little extension that is going to move slightly anterior. So scaphoid, lunate, triquetrum, pisiform, trapezium, trapezoid, capitate, hamate. Your textbook actually has a little mnemonic device that helps you remember this by using the first letter of each bone. So it goes, Susan left the party to take Kathy home. Scaphoid, lunate, triquetrum, pisiform, trapezium, trapezoid, capitate, hamate. So those are the wrist bones. So we move towards the palm of your hand. So if you put the palm of your hand here, this part is covered by these bones. So you'd have the metacarpals, and they're numbered by the location. The one by the thumb is number 1, the one by the pinky is number 5. So metacarpal 1, metacarpal 2, metacarpal 3, metacarpal 4, metacarpal 5. Okay? As you move towards the fingers, we have bones known as phalanges. And the phalanges are going to have 3 bones, except for the thumb that has 2. And so these are known as proximal and distal phalanges, proximal, middle, and distal, proximal, middle, and distal, proximal, middle, distal, proximal, middle, distal. And that's the hand for you.